On a desolate road, an elderly billionaire is left behind. But when Keanu Reeves steps in with a jaw-dropping move, the unimaginable becomes reality, shocking everyone. In the fading light of an autumn afternoon, Antonio Moreira stood motionless at the edge of Lake Solitude, watching ripples expand across the water's surface. At 52, his once dark hair was now streaked with silver, framing a face marked more by experience than age. The small town of Oak Ridge, Vermont, had been his escape 5 years ago, a place where no one knew his name or the weight he carried. Now, as maple leaves drifted onto the lake's surface like forgotten memories, he felt the fragile peace he'd built beginning to fracture. "Mr. Moreira?" The voice behind him was hesitant. Antonio turned to find Lily, the 19-year-old who worked weekends at the town's only bookstore. "For you left this behind." The girl held out his wallet, worn at the edges like everything else in his life. "Thank you." Antonio's voice was steady, practiced. He'd perfected the art of appearing whole. Taking the wallet, he noticed Lily's gaze, lingering on the folded newspaper article visible in its clear pocket, the one headline he could never bring himself to remove. "I should get back," Lily said, her curiosity evident but restrained. The town respected boundaries, which was precisely why Antonio had chosen it. As Lily walked away, Antonio's phone vibrated in his pocket. The number was unknown, but the area code was unmistakable. San Francisco. His heart stuttered as he answered. "Antonio Moreira." The male voice was unfamiliar. "Speaking. This is Detective João with the San Francisco Police Department. I'm calling about the Clara case." The world tilted beneath his feet. 5 years of careful distance collapsed. In an instant. "The case was closed," he managed, his voice suddenly hoarse. "New evidence has surfaced. We need you to come in." That night, Antonio packed a single suitcase, his movements mechanical. The call had awakened something he'd fought to keep dormant: hope. Perhaps, or its more dangerous cousin, justice. As he placed a framed photograph on top of his clothes, a smiling young woman with his eyes and a future that had been stolen, Antonio made a silent promise. This time he wouldn't return to Oak Ridge until he found what he was looking for. Detective João slouched in his desk chair, staring at the ceiling tiles of the San Francisco Police Department's cold case unit. At 45, he carried the perpetual dishevelment of someone too preoccupied with other people's tragedies to maintain his own appearance. His salt and pepper hair needed a cut, and his rumpled button-down hadn't seen an iron in weeks. The only pristine item in his possession was the leather-bound notebook in which he documented the details others missed. "You called him?" The question came from his new partner, Maria Helena, 32, immaculately dressed, and still believing in the system. João nodded, eyes still fixed upward. "He'll come." "You don't know that. It's been 5 years." João finally looked at his partner. "When your wife's murderer walks free on a technicality, time doesn't heal. It festers." The Clara case had nearly broken João when it first crossed his desk. Clara Moreira, 43, found strangled in her apartment 3 weeks before a major environmental conservation announcement. The prime suspect, tech entrepreneur Ricardo Mendes, had walked free when crucial evidence was ruled inadmissible. The detective who'd made the procedural error was now retired, but João had never stopped searching for another way in. "The witness is credible?" Maria Helena asked, leafing through the file. "Keanu Reeves, building maintenance worker, says he saw Mendes enter Clara's apartment building that night. Never came forward because he was undocumented at the time. Now he's legal and saw Mendes's face on a magazine cover." "After 5 years? That's thin." João slammed his notebook shut. "It's a thread, and Antonio Moreira deserves every thread we can find." Maria Helena studied her partner, recognizing the personal investment that both made João exceptional and dangerous. "Just don't promise what we can't deliver." João's reply was interrupted by the department secretary. "Detective, there's someone here to see you." Antonio Moreira stood in the doorway, his posture rigid as if bracing against a storm. João rose to his feet, struck by the quiet dignity he maintained, despite everything. "Mr. Moreira," he said, extending his hand, Thank you for coming. I didn't have a choice, Antonio replied softly. Ricardo Mendez surveyed San Francisco from the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. At 41, he'd built Vertex Developments into a tech empire valued at billions, his handsome face a fixture on magazine covers, celebrating American entrepreneurship. Running a hand through his precisely styled dark hair, he allowed himself a rare moment of unguarded reflection. 5 years ago, he'd nearly lost everything. The accusation, the investigation, the trial, they should have destroyed him. Instead, he'd emerged stronger, his reputation intact thanks to the best legal team money could buy and a crucial ruling by Judge Theodore Hamilton. His assistant's voice interrupted through the intercom. "Your 2 o'clock is here. Send him in." Ricardo straightened his tailored suit jacket, his moment of vulnerability locked away. Judge Hamilton entered the office, his judicial confidence diminished in retirement. At 68, he moved with the cautious steps of a man who knew his legacy was complicated. "Ricardo," he greeted, accepting the offered handshake. "You're looking well." "You seem troubled, Theodore." Ricardo gestured to a leather chair. "Scotch?" "No, thank you." Hamilton's fingers tapped against his knee. "I heard they've reopened the Clara case." Ricardo's expression remained neutral, though his pulse quickened. "Based on what?" "A new witness has come forward." "After 5 years?" "Hardly credible." Hamilton leaned forward. "The husband is back in town." Ricardo turned to the window, allowing himself 5 seconds of genuine concern before responding. "Antonio Moreira is a grieving husband grasping at straws." The case was decided. Double jeopardy applies. "This isn't about legal exposure, Ricardo. It's about public perception. Your company is about to go public. Any hint of scandal will be handled," Ricardo finished, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Is there anything else I should know?" Hamilton hesitated. The detective leading the investigation, João, he doesn't let go easily. Ricardo nodded, filing away the name. "Thank you for the warning, Theodore. Your loyalty continues to be appreciated." After the judge left, Ricardo contacted his head of security. "I need everything you can find on Detective João," he instructed, "and increase surveillance on Antonio Moreira." The cafe across from the police station buzzed with midday activity, providing the anonymity Antonio needed. He stirred, his untouched coffee, processing what Detective João had shared. "A new witness is promising," he said, "but you had a strong case before, and it fell apart." João nodded. "The evidence suppression was a mistake, one we can't make again." Antonio studied him, noting the intensity in his eyes. "This isn't just professional for you." "No case is ever just professional." He hesitated before continuing. "My sister was murdered when I was 15. They never found who did it." The revelation shifted something between them, a recognition of shared understanding. Antonio reached for his pocket and removed a worn photograph. Clara would have been 50 next month. She was about to announce a major environmental protection initiative, maybe changing the conservation landscape forever. His voice remained steady, though his fingers trembled slightly. "The night before she died, she called me, said she was onto something big. I thought she meant in her research." João leaned forward. "You never mentioned a call." The original detective didn't think it was relevant, and after the case fell apart, he shrugged, the gesture containing multitudes. "What was the point?" "Did she say anything specific?" "Just that she'd found a connection no one else had seen, that it could change everything." Antonio's eyes met his. "I've spent 5 years wondering what she meant." As they talked, neither noticed the man at a corner table, his attention divided between his laptop and their conversation, or how his hand occasionally touched the device in his pocket, recording every word. Lily paced the length of her brother Keanu's small apartment, her anxiety manifesting in perpetual motion. "You don't understand what you're getting into," she insisted. "Mendez isn't just some random guy. He owns half the city." Keanu sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea. At 35, he was a He carried himself with the quiet resilience of someone who had rebuilt his life piece by careful piece. I know what I saw, Lily. 5 years ago. How can you be sure? Some faces you don't forget. He looked up at his sister. That man who comes to your bookstore, Antonio, that was his wife. Lily stopped pacing. Mr. Moreira, he never mentioned a wife. Because his wife was murdered, and the man who did it walked free. Keanu's voice hardened. I was afraid then, I'm not anymore. The doorbell interrupted their argument. Keanu approached cautiously, checking the peephole before opening the door to reveal Antonio and Detective João. Mr. Reeves? João asked, showing his badge. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. Keanu nodded, glancing at Antonio with recognition and regret. Please come in. As they entered, Lily stepped forward. Mr. Moreira, I didn't realize that I was hiding? Antonio finished with a sad smile. We all have our reasons, Lily. The four gathered in Keanu's modest living room, the weight of their connection settling around them. Keanu recounted what he'd seen that night, Ricardo Mendez entering Clara's building at 11:42 p.m., appearing agitated. He'd been working late fixing a plumbing issue when he saw Mendez through the lobby's glass doors. Why come forward now? João asked, though his tone held no accusation. Keanu glanced at Lily. I saw his face on a magazine at the store where my sister works. Tech visionary of the decade, like nothing had happened. He turned to Antonio. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. Antonio's response was interrupted by the sharp crack of breaking glass. João was on his feet, instantly, gun drawn. Everyone down. A second shot shattered the lamp beside Keanu, sending them all to the floor. João crawled to the window, cautiously peering out to see a black sedan speeding away. Is everyone all right? He called, scanning the room. Keanu nodded, shaken, but unharmed. Lily had a small cut on her arm from the glass. Antonio sat with his back against the wall, his expression distant but composed, a man accustomed to crisis. This wasn't a warning, he said quietly. It was a message. Someone knows we're here. The safe house was a small cabin on the outskirts of Marin County, its existence known to only a handful within the department. As night fell, Antonio stood on the porch, watching fog roll in from the bay. The events of the day had left him exhausted but oddly clear-headed. For years he'd lived in a limbo of unresolved grief. Now at least he was moving, even if the path led to more pain. The door opened behind him as João stepped out, 2 mugs in hand. Tea, he offered, though I'd guess you'd prefer something stronger. He accepted the mug with a grateful nod. This isn't my first safe house, Detective. João, he corrected. After someone shoots at you, I think we can drop formalities. They stood in comfortable silence, the fog muffling the world beyond. Eventually, Antonio spoke. Keanu and Lily. Secure at a different location, Maria Helena is with them. Do you trust her? Your partner? João considered the question. Maria Helena plays by the book. Sometimes that's limiting, but she's solid. And you don't play by the book? The book is a good starting point. João leaned against the railing. But justice and law aren't always the same thing. Antonio studied him, recognizing a kindred spirit. How did your sister die? The question didn't surprise him. Strangled in the park 2 blocks from our house, I found her. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. No, Antonio said softly. It wasn't. That's the thing about grief. It exists outside of time. João nodded, understanding perfectly. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start building a case Mendez can't escape. As Antonio turned to go inside, João's phone vibrated. The message contained a single image, a photograph of Antonio on the porch of the supposedly secret safe house, taken moments ago. Below it, text read, "Walk away, detective." João deleted the message without comment, his resolve hardening. Whoever was watching had just made a critical mistake. They'd made it personal. Ricardo poured himself a second scotch, the only outward sign of his agitation. The shooting had been unauthorized, a reckless move by a security contractor who'd now been permanently removed from the equation. Such crude tactics might silence ordinary witnesses, but they only intensified police involvement. His private. Elevator chimed as his head of security, Santiago Vega, arrived. Santiago's background in military intelligence had proven invaluable over the years, his methods efficient and typically untraceable. "The situation is contained," Santiago reported without preamble. "Reeves and his sister are at a police safe. House in Oakland. Moreira and João are at a cabin in Marine." Ricardo nodded. "And the message?" "Delivered. João's reaction suggests he won't be deterred." "I didn't expect him to be." Ricardo swirled his drink. "What about Clara Moreira's apartment?" "Cleared 5 years ago as instructed. The new tenants have renovated extensively." Ricardo set down his glass. "And her personal effects?" "In police storage. Nothing of concern." Ricardo moved to his desk, opening a drawer to reveal a small leather journal. "Except this." Santiago's expression remained neutral, though his posture stiffened slightly. "Where did you get that?" "Clara always kept it with her. Notes about her research, her conservation projects." Ricardo's finger traced the cover. "And in the final pages, some rather troubling observations about certain financial transactions she noticed while reviewing documents in Theodore's office." "Why keep it?" Ricardo smiled thinly. "Insurance. Theodore was useful during the trial, but his anxiety makes him unpredictable." "And now?" "Now," Ricardo said, returning the journal to the drawer, "we need to accelerate our timeline. The IPO launches in 10 days. By then, this distraction needs to be eliminated." He looked directly at Santiago. "Not with bullets, with doubt. Discredit the witness, isolate Moreira, and find leverage on João." Santiago nodded once. "Consider it done." After he left, Ricardo returned to the window, watching fog engulf the city lights. 5 years ago, he'd silenced a woman who'd stumbled onto connections that threatened everything he'd built. Now her husband had returned, awakening ghosts he thought long buried. "You should have stayed away, Antonio," he murmured to the darkness. Morning found Antonio and João at the storage facility where Clara's belongings had been kept since her death. Antonio had visited once shortly after the funeral, but hadn't been able to face returning. Now, as João unlocked the unit, he steeled himself for the emotions that would inevitably follow. The space was small but organized, boxes labeled in Antonio's neat handwriting: research, personal, conservation projects. A bicycle leaned against one wall, its tires flat from disuse, a life reduced to categories and containers. "What exactly are we looking for?" Antonio asked, trying to maintain professional distance. "Anything connected to her last days, phone records, notes, journals." João began examining the boxes marked research. Antonio moved to a smaller container labeled personal. Inside were photographs, birthday cards, a dried corsage from their anniversary. Beneath these mementos lay a leather-bound day planner, the kind Clara had insisted on keeping even in the digital age. She always wrote everything down, Antonio explained, opening the planner to the final week of Clara's life. The pages were filled with his wife's distinctive handwriting, meeting schedules, research notes, conservation deadlines. And there, on the day before her death, a single entry circled in red: JW, 9 p.m., follow the money. João looked over his shoulder. JW? Antonio shook his head. I don't recognize the initials. May I? João carefully took the planner, flipping back through earlier pages. Here, 3 weeks earlier, JW confirmed pattern. Need more evidence. He continued searching. And a month before that, JW concerned about VM connections. Proceed carefully. VM could be Vertex Mendez, Antonio suggested, his pulse quickening. And JW could be our key to understanding what Clara discovered. João photographed the relevant pages. We need to identify everyone in Clara's circle with these initials. As they continued searching, Antonio uncovered a business card tucked into a research folder. James Wilson, financial forensics consultant, he read aloud. JW. Joan took the card, noting the address in the financial district. Let's pay Mr. Wilson a visit. As they left, neither noticed the small tracking device attached to the underside of Joan's car, blinking silently as it transmitted their location. James Wilson's office occupied a modest suite in a high-rise filled with more prestigious financial firms. At 60, he carried the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent decades examining numbers and finding the stories they told. His grey hair was precisely cut, his office meticulously organized. Clara Moreira, he repeated when they introduced themselves. Brilliant woman. Her death was a tremendous loss. You worked with her? Joan asked. Wilson hesitated. Not officially. She was reviewing some land conservation documents for Judge Hamilton when she noticed some unusual patterns in case financials. The judge referred her to me for insight. What kind of patterns? Antonio leaned forward, hunger for understanding evident in his posture. Financial holdings being liquidated or transferred just before major judicial decisions about land use and environmental regulations, not the judges. He was concerned about potential conflicts of interest with other parties. Wilson adjusted his glasses. Clara had an exceptional eye for connections. Did these connections involve Ricardo Mendez? Joan asked directly. Wilson's expression tightened. I've built my career on discretion, Detective. What Clara and I discussed was confidential. My wife was murdered, Antonio said quietly. Confidentiality doesn't extend beyond death. Wilson studied him, compassion warring with caution. Finally, he stood and closed his office door. Clara identified a pattern of investment activities preceding major judicial decisions, specifically in Judge Hamilton's courtroom. Companies would gain significant value following his rulings. Legal insider trading, Joan concluded. Precisely. And at the center of these investments was a shell company that Clara traced back to Vertex Developments. She believed Ricardo Mendez was essentially betting on court outcomes he somehow knew in advance. He was bribing the judge, Antonio said, the pieces falling into place. That was her theory. She was gathering evidence when Wilson trailed off, the implication clear. Joan leaned forward. Would you testify to this? Wilson's expression grew troubled. I advised Clara to take what she found to the authorities. The next day, she was dead. A week later, my office was broken into. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear. Oh, you're afraid, Antonio observed without judgment. With good reason. Wilson opened a drawer and removed a flash drive. This contains Clara's research, financial records, transaction timelines, entity connections. I kept a copy because I promised her I would, but I've never had the courage to use it. Joan accepted the drive. We can protect you. Wilson smiled sadly. Like you protected Clara or Keanu Reeves? He shook his head. I'll provide a statement, but only after you've built a case strong enough to ensure Mendez can't retaliate. They left Wilson's office. Joan noticed a black sedan parked across the street. The same model from the shooting. We're being followed, he murmured to Antonio. Act natural. They entered a department store, moving quickly through the aisles and exiting through a service entrance. Joan led them down several blocks before hailing a taxi. We can't go. Back to the safe house, Antonio said as they pulled away. Joan nodded. I know somewhere else. The cabin belonged to Joan's uncle, a remote property in the redwoods north of the city. As evening fell, Antonio sat at the rustic wooden table, reviewing the files from Wilson's flash drive while Joan secured the perimeter. Clara was right, he called as Joan re-entered. These transactions align perfectly with Hamilton's rulings, including the exclusion of evidence in Mendez's trial. Joan looked over his shoulder at the laptop screen. Hamilton ruled to suppress the DNA evidence found in Clara's apartment, claiming improper collection procedures. A week later, Vertex Developments announced a major acquisition that doubled its value. Hamilton had invested heavily through this shell company just before. Antonio pushed back from the table, anger and vindication warring in his expression. They were partners. Which gives us motive. Joan began pacing. Clara discovered their arrangement. She was gathering evidence that could have sent both Mendes and Hamilton to prison, so Mendes killed her and Hamilton protected him in court. Antonio's voice remained steady, though his hands trembled slightly. The perfect arrangement. Not perfect. João stopped pacing. Because you never stopped looking. And now we have Keanu Reeves placing Mendes at the scene, financial records suggesting motive, and a clear connection between Mendes and the judge who saved him. Antonio closed the laptop. It won't bring Clara back. No, João agreed softly. But it might bring her justice. The moment was interrupted by João's phone. The caller ID showed Maria Helena. João, he answered. We have a problem, Maria Helena said without preamble. Keanu Reeves is gone. What do you mean, gone? He went for a cigarette outside. The safe house. Security camera shows him getting into a black sedan voluntarily. João's gaze met Antonio's. Not voluntarily. They have his sister. After ending the call, João explained the situation. Without Keanu's testimony, the case weakens significantly. Antonio didn't flinch. Then we need to find him. And Lily. I'll have Maria Helena check traffic cameras near the safe house. João hesitated. There's something else. The department's launching an internal investigation. Someone claims I'm too personally involved and potentially tampering with evidence. Mendes, Antonio concluded. He's trying to isolate us. And it's working. João ran a hand through his hair. I've been placed on administrative leave pending review. Antonio stood, moving to the window to watch darkness settle among the trees. 5 years ago, I lost everything. My wife, my faith in justice. Eventually, my willingness to fight. He turned to face João. I won't lose again. João recognized the determination in his stance, the same resolve that had kept him searching for his sister's killer across decades. We go unofficial then, off the books. Where do we start? With the one person Mendes trusts to do his dirty work. Finding Santiago Vega proved surprisingly simple. João's contacts in private, security knew him by reputation. Ex-military, ruthlessly efficient, exclusively loyal to Mendes. Every night at 9 p.m., he visited the same upscale bar in Nob Hill, sitting at the same corner table with a perfect view of both entrances. Antonio entered first, taking a seat at the bar. In a simple black suit borrowed from the cabin's previous guests, his silver-streaked hair combed back, he blended perfectly with the affluent clientele. João followed 20 minutes later, positioning himself near the exit. At EY. Precisely 9 p.m., Santiago arrived, his observant gaze sweeping the room before he claimed his usual table. Antonio waited until he'd ordered his first drink before approaching. Is this seat taken? He asked, his voice calm despite the hammering of his heart. Santiago looked up, recognition flickering briefly in his eyes before being masked by professional neutrality. I'm expecting someone. No, you're not, Antonio sat down. But I suspect you know who I am. Antonio Moreira. Santiago didn't bother denying it. This is unwise. Where are Keanu and Lily Reeves? Santiago took a measured sip of his whiskey. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Just as you know about Clara, Judge Hamilton, and the financial arrangements your boss has worked so hard to hide. Something shifted in Santiago's expression, not surprise, but recalculation. You're making dangerous accusations without evidence. We have the evidence. Antonio leaned forward. Clara's research, financial records, Hamilton's involvement, Keanu Reeves' testimony placing Mendes at Clara's apartment. And yet you're here, alone, without police protection. Santiago set down his glass. That suggests otherwise. I'm not alone, Antonio nodded subtly toward João by the door. And I'm not without protection. Santiago glanced at João, then back to Antonio. What do you want? The truth, and the Reeves' safety. A humorless smile crossed Santiago's face. The truth rarely brings comfort, Mr. Moreira. Try me. Santiago studied him, making some internal calculation. Ricardo didn't kill your wife. Evidence suggests otherwise. Evidence can be misleading. Santiago finished his drink. Clara Moreira discovered a financial connection that threatened powerful people. She approached the wrong person with her concerns. Judge Hamilton, Antonio concluded. Santiago neither confirmed nor denied. The Reeves siblings are unharmed. They'll be released when certain business matters conclude next week. The IPO, Antonio realized, once Vertex Developments goes public, the money will be untouchable. Santiago stood. Consider this conversation a professional courtesy. Go back to Vermont, Mr. Moreira. There's nothing for you here but more grief. As he turned to leave, Antonio spoke one final time. Tell Ricardo I'm not going anywhere until I have justice for my wife. Santiago paused. Justice and vengeance aren't the same thing. Then he was gone, moving efficiently through the crowded bar. João joined him at the table. What did he say? Enough to confirm we're on the right track. Antonio's gaze remained fixed on the door where Santiago had exited. And that we're running out of time. The next morning brought rain, heavy drops drumming against the cabin's roof as Antonio and João reviewed their options. With João on administrative leave and official channels potentially compromised, their resources were limited. We need Hamilton, João insisted. He's the weak link. If we can get him to flip on Mendez, he won't, Antonio interrupted. He's been protecting Mendez for years. Why would he stop now? Because Mendez might be planning to eliminate him after the IPO. Hamilton's a liability. The only person who can directly connect Mendez to Clara's murder. Antonio considered this. How do we approach him? Before João could answer, his phone chimed with an email notification. The sender was anonymous, but the subject line read, For Clara. The only content was an address in Pacific Heights. And a time, 2 p.m. Could be a trap, João warned, or it could be someone else who knows the truth. Antonio checked his watch. We have 3 hours to decide. The address led to an elegant townhouse overlooking the bay. At precisely 2 p.m., João and Antonio approached the front door, both tense with anticipation. João's hand rested near his concealed weapon as Antonio rang the bell. The woman who answered was in her 60s, her silver hair elegantly styled, her posture impeccable despite obvious signs of illness. Antonio Moreira, she said, her voice cultured but weak. You look exactly as Clara described you. Please come in. The home's interior was tastefully appointed, but showed signs of medical equipment being recently removed. The woman led them to a sunroom overlooking a carefully maintained garden. I'm Margaret Hamilton, she introduced herself once they were seated. Theodore's wife. Antonio stiffened at the name. You contacted us. Margaret nodded. I've been following your return to San Francisco with great interest. When Theodore mentioned Detective João's involvement, I knew it was time. Time for what? João asked cautiously. The truth. Margaret poured tea with slightly trembling hands. I'm dying, Detective. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me weeks, perhaps a month. At this stage of life, one becomes concerned with setting affairs. In order. What affairs are those? Antonio's voice remained controlled, though his fingers gripped his teacup tightly. My husband made a terrible mistake 5 years ago, one that cost a promising woman her life and denied a husband justice. Margaret's gaze was direct, unflinching. I can't undo that damage, but I can ensure Ricardo Mendez doesn't profit from it further. She removed a USB drive from her pocket. This contains recorded conversations between Theodore and Ricardo, dating back 6 years. It includes discussions of judicial decisions, financial arrangements, and... She hesitated. And Clara's discovery of their arrangement. João accepted the drive with cautious optimism. Why are you doing this? Because Theodore is a coward who sold his integrity, and I refuse to let that be his legacy. Margaret turned to Antonio. And because no one should have to endure what you've endured. Does your husband know you're doing this? Antonio asked. No, and he won't until it's done. Margaret's expression hardened. Theodore made his choice years ago. Now I'm making mine. As they prepared to leave, Margaret stopped Antonio with a gentle hand on his arm. Clara came to see me, you know, a week before she died. She was troubled by what she'd found, but determined to expose it. She mentioned you, how you'd supported her conservation work from the beginning, even when it seemed hopeless. Margaret smiled sadly. She was very proud to be your wife. The words broke through Antonio's carefully maintained composure. For the first time since returning to San Francisco, he allowed tears to fall freely. "Thank you," he whispered. Outside, rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean beneath a clearing sky. Antonio looked toward the bay, feeling something shift within him. Not closure exactly, but purpose. "We need to get this to someone we trust," Joan said, indicating the drive. "With Margaret Hamilton's testimony and these recordings, we can build a case even without Keanu Reeves." Antonio nodded. "And we need to find the Reeves siblings before the IPO." "I might know someone who can help with that," Joan replied, already dialing his phone. The IPO launch party for Vertex. Developments transformed the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art into a showcase of wealth and influence. Ricardo Mendez stood at the center of it all, accepting congratulations with practiced humility as stock prices soared on opening day. Judge Theodore Hamilton watched from the periphery, his public smile masking private unease. His wife's sudden trip to visit her sister had left him unsettled, as had Ricardo's increasing remoteness in recent days. "Quite an achievement," a voice spoke beside him. Hamilton turned to find Detective Maria Helena, impeccably dressed in an evening gown that blended perfectly with the gathering. "Detective, I wasn't aware you were on the guest list." "Special invitation." Maria Helena sipped champagne casually. "Your wife sends her regards." Hamilton's smile faltered. "I'm not sure I understand." "She's been quite helpful, as have you indirectly." Maria Helena nodded toward a server carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Hamilton followed her gaze to recognize Keanu Reeves, discreetly photographing the event while maintaining his cover. "What is this?" Hamilton hissed, anxiety blooming. "Justice finally arriving." Maria Helena gestured subtly toward the entrance, where Antonio Moreira appeared, escorted by Joan. "I believe you know Mr. Moreira. His wife possessed the same ethical clarity you once had before Ricardo Mendez purchased it." Hamilton's composure cracked. "You don't understand the complexity. I understand perfectly." Maria Helena's friendly demeanor vanished. "In approximately 3 minutes, federal agents will enter this room with warrants for both you and Mendez. Securities fraud, conspiracy, and for Mendez, murder." Hamilton paled. "You can't prove." "We call. Have your recordings, Theodore. Years of them." Margaret was quite thorough. As Hamilton processed this betrayal, Ricardo approached, champagne in hand. "Theodore, the SEC chairman was asking for you." Maria Helena smiled pleasantly. "Mr. Mendez, Detective Maria Helena, SFPD. We've been looking forward to meeting you." "Properly." Before Ricardo could respond, Antonio stepped forward, his gaze unwavering as it met Ricardo's. Recognition flickered across Ricardo's face, followed by cold calculation. "Mr. Moreira, this is a private event." "So was my wife's funeral," Antonio replied, his voice steady. "You should have attended. It might have seemed less suspicious." Ricardo's expression hardened. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but this isn't the venue for personal grievances." "No," Joan agreed, joining them. "The courtroom will be a more appropriate venue for all of us." As if on cue, federal agents appeared at the entrance, moving purposefully through the crowd. Santiago materialized at Ricardo's side, assessing the situation with professional detachment. "Sir, we should leave," he murmured. "Too late," Maria Helena replied, producing her badge. "Ricardo Mendez, you're under arrest for the murder of Clara Moreira, securities fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." The room fell silent as agents surrounded them. Hamilton, seeing no escape, slumped in defeat. Ricardo, however, maintained his composure, even as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. "This is a mistake," he stated calmly. "My lawyers will have this dismissed by morning." Antonio stepped closer until they were face to face. "They won't find a friendly judge this time." As Ricardo was led away, his eyes found Santiago across the room. An almost imperceptible nod passed between them, a contingency plan activated. The press conference the next morning drew national attention. The U.S. attorney stood before a forest of microphones, detailing charges against Ricardo Mendez and Judge Theodore Hamilton. Behind her stood João Maria Helena and Antonio, a united front against corruption. "The investigation has uncovered a pattern of judicial influence spanning years," the U.S. attorney explained. "We believe Mr. Mendez murdered Clara Moreira when she discovered his illegal arrangement with Judge Hamilton." As cameras flashed, Antonio felt a strange hollowness. Justice was proceeding, yet Clara remained gone. When his turn came to speak, he kept his statement brief. "Clara dedicated her life to protecting our natural resources," he said, his voice steady. "In the end, she gave her life exposing those who would exploit them. I ask only that her work continue, that the lands she fought to preserve remain protected." The press erupted with questions, but Antonio stepped back, emotionally spent. Outside the courthouse, João found him sitting alone on a bench. "Hamilton's cooperating," João reported, taking a seat beside him. "Trading testimony for a reduced sentence. He's confirmed everything, the bribes, the cover-up, Mendez's motive." Antonio nodded absently. "And Keanu?" "In protective custody with Lily until the trial." "Both are safe," João hesitated. "Santiago Vega disappeared last night. We have alerts at airports and borders, but—" "He's gone," Antonio finished. "Professional enough to have an escape plan." They sat in contemplative silence until João spoke again. "What will you do now?" "I don't know," Antonio admitted. "For 5 years, finding Clara's killer was all that mattered. Now—" He trailed off, gazing across the city toward the distant hills. João understood the emptiness that follows justice too long delayed. It doesn't fix everything. "No," Antonio agreed softly. "But it's a start." 1 month later, Antonio stood at the edge of the Sierra Nevada conservation area that Clara had fought to protect. The land had been saved from Vertex's development plans when Ricardo's assets were frozen. Now, as autumn painted the landscape, in gold and crimson, Antonio had returned to complete one final task. He walked the forest path alone, carrying a small urn containing a portion of Clara's ashes. She had wanted to rest here, among the ancient trees and clear streams, a place she'd loved more than any other. Finding a sunlit clearing beside a cascading brook, Antonio knelt and opened the urn. "We did it," he whispered, releasing her. "Ashes to the gentle breeze. The land is safe, and so am I." As he stood, a movement at the forest's edge caught his attention. A figure observed him from the shadows, tall with long dark hair and an unmistakable presence. Keanu Reeves stepped forward, his expression serene. "Mr. Moreira," he acknowledged with a slight bow. "Mr. Reeves," Antonio replied. "I didn't expect to see you here. I come sometimes to remember why truth matters." Keanu's gaze swept across the pristine landscape. "Your wife understood that some things are worth any price. How did you find me?" A mysterious smile crossed Keanu's face. "Some connections transcend ordinary explanation." They walked together in companionable silence until reaching Antonio's car. Before parting, Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "What will you do now?" Antonio looked back toward the forest. Clara started a foundation to protect these lands. Someone needs to continue that work. Keanu nodded approvingly. The best memorial is continued purpose. He reached into his pocket and removed a simple wooden pendant carved in the shape of a tree. "She would have wanted you to have this." As Antonio accepted the gift, confusion crossed his face. "How did you—" "Some questions don't need answers," Keanu replied cryptically. "Just as some journeys don't end with justice but begin with it." With that, he turned and walked back into the forest, his figure gradually blending with the dappled shadows until he seemed to disappear entirely. Antonio stood watching long after Keanu had gone, the pendant warm in his palm, feeling for the first time in years that tomorrow held possibilities rather than just memories. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in fiery hues, Antonio made a phone call to the small bookstore in Oak Ridge, Vermont. "Lily, it's Antonio Moreira. I was wondering if that job offer still stands." He smiled at her enthusiastic response. "Good. I have some ideas for the environmental section we discussed." As night fell, Antonio sat on the porch of his rented cabin, watching stars emerge above the Sierra Nevada. The weight of grief remained, but alongside it now existed something he'd thought lost forever: hope. Clara's voice seemed to whisper in the rustling leaves. Some endings are just beginnings in disguise. For the first time in 5 years, Antonio Moreira fell asleep without the burden of unfinished business, the wooden pendant resting over his heart, a talisman guiding him toward whatever came next.